Power has always had a uniform. For decades after independence, the image of authority across much of Africa looked strikingly similar to that of Europe. Dark suits, silk ties, polished shoes, and formal chambers designed to mirror colonial capitals became the visual language of seriousness and legitimacy. Over time, this image hardened into an unspoken rule. To look powerful, one had to dress like the former rulers. Few questioned where this rule came from or who it truly served. Then, on an ordinary parliamentary morning in Accra, that rule quietly collapsed. Members of Parliament walked into the chamber not in Western suits, but in hand-woven fugu smocks. The colors were bold, the fabric was local, the message was unmistakable. This was not a cultural festival, not a national holiday, and not a symbolic photo opportunity staged for tourists. It was a regular session of the legislature, conducted in the highest space of state authority. What made this moment politically significant was not the clothing itself, but the collective choice behind it. Lawmakers from opposing parties appeared in the same traditional attire, signaling that this was not partisan theater, it was an institutional statement. Ghana was not rejecting modern governance, nor was it retreating into nostalgia. Instead, it was asking a deeper question. Who decides what authority should look like in Africa? The decision followed public mockery directed at President John Dramani Mahama for wearing a fugu during a state visit abroad, rather than respond with anger or apology. The country responded with consensus. Parliament transformed a personal moment into a national position. In doing so, it elevated traditional dress from personal expression to constitutional presence. This video is not about fashion. It is about how symbols operate inside power. It is about how something as simple as clothing can reveal unfinished struggles over identity, sovereignty, and dignity. By examining Ghana and later Burkina Faso, we will see how African states are quietly renegotiating the meaning of authority, not through speeches or declarations, but through what they choose to wear when they govern. When the Parliament of Ghana convened wearing fugu smocks instead of Western suits, the action carried a weight far beyond visual symbolism. This was not an isolated gesture by a single politician, nor a cultural celebration staged for public relations. It was a coordinated decision taken inside the legislative body that defines national norms and legitimizes power. In political terms, that distinction matters. Parliaments do more than pass laws. They also set behavioral standards. What is considered appropriate language, acceptable conduct, and even proper appearance inside a chamber becomes a reference point for the entire state. By choosing fugu collectively, Ghana's lawmakers effectively declared that traditional African attire is not informal, backward, or ceremonial. It is suitable for governance at the highest level. The most striking aspect of the moment was the absence of partisan division. Members from rival political parties appeared in the same attire. In a political environment where symbolism is often weaponized for party advantage, this unity suggested a deeper consensus. The issue was framed not as ideology, but as dignity, not as protest, but as normalization. This act also quietly challenged an inherited assumption that legitimacy must visually resemble European governance. The Western suit, introduced during colonial administration, became embedded as the uniform of authority. Long after independence, it remained the default costume of seriousness. Even when the political systems beneath it had changed, Ghana's parliament disrupted that continuity without confrontation. No speeches denounced the suit. No resolutions attacked Western culture. The chamber simply redefined what power could look like. Internationally, the message was equally deliberate. The action followed public ridicule aimed at the Ghanaian president for wearing traditional clothing abroad. Instead of escalating the matter diplomatically, the legislature reframed it institutionally. By doing so, Ghana communicated that its identity would be defended not by outrage, but by confidence. If mocked, the response would be multiplication, not retreat. Domestically, the implications were clear. Citizens watching the session saw their own cultural heritage occupy a space often associated with distance and elitism. The state appeared less foreign, less inherited, and more rooted. That psychological shift should not be underestimated. When people see themselves reflected in power, authority becomes less abstract and more legitimate. In this sense, the fugu session was not about clothing at all. It was about reclaiming the right to define national seriousness. Ghana did not ask permission. It simply acted, and in doing so, reset the visual language of its democracy. To understand why the fugu could return so forcefully into Ghana's parliament, one must look beyond the present moment and into the deeper history of power embedded in the garment itself. The fugu was never ordinary clothing. Long before it entered modern politics, it carried authority, discipline, and identity. The garment originated among communities in northern Ghana, including the Dagomba, Mamprusi, and Gonja. In its earliest form, the fugu was worn by warriors, chiefs, and horsemen. Its heavy hand-woven cotton strips were designed for durability, while its wide and flared shape allowed movement in combat and travel. Even the embroidery around the neckline carried meaning, signaling status, lineage, or achievement. In this context, clothing was not decoration. It was communication. Colonial rule disrupted this visual language. British administration introduced European dress as the uniform of power. Over time, the suit became associated with authority, education, and legitimacy, while indigenous clothing was pushed into the category of tradition or folklore. This separation was not accidental. It trained elites to associate governance with foreign appearance and local identity with the private sphere. Ghana's independence in 1957 briefly challenged this hierarchy. When Kwame Nkrumah chose to wear the fugu while declaring independence, the decision was deliberate. It was a rejection of the colonial aesthetic at the very moment a new state was born. The message was clear. Political freedom without cultural self-definition would remain incomplete. For a time, the fugu stood at the center of national symbolism. Yet, as decades passed, the Western suit quietly returned to dominance. International diplomacy, bureaucratic routines, and post-colonial respectability pulled leaders back into inherited dress codes. The fugu remained visible, but mostly on ceremonial occasions. It survived as heritage, not as a daily language of power. The parliamentary moment reversed that trajectory. By bringing the fugu back into routine governance, Ghana reactivated its original political meaning. The garment stopped being a reminder of the past and became a tool of the present. It reconnected authority to local history rather than foreign validation. Seen this way, the fugu is not competing with the suit as fashion. It is competing as a symbol of where legitimacy comes from. Ghana's parliament did not invent a new identity. It recovered one that had been set aside. In doing so, it reminded the country that sovereignty is not only written into constitutions, it is also worn. While Ghana used parliament to normalize traditional dress through consensus, Burkina Faso took a more direct and institutional path. There, traditional clothing did not simply reappear in political spaces. It was deliberately built into the machinery of the state. This distinction matters because it shows how symbolism can move from gesture to rule. Burkina Faso's approach centered on the idea that if authority continues to dress in inherited colonial forms, then colonial influence survives at the level of daily governance. Changing speeches or slogans would not be enough. The visible structure of the state had to change as well. One of the clearest expressions of this logic appeared in the justice system. Courts are among the most symbolically powerful institutions of any country. They represent final authority, judgment, and legitimacy. For decades, many African court systems retained robes and visual styles modeled on French or British traditions. In Burkina Faso, this inheritance came under direct scrutiny. The state moved to replace imported fabrics and colonial aesthetics with garments made from faso dan fani, a hand-woven cloth produced by local artisans. This shift was not cosmetic. By standardizing locally produced fabric in judicial attire, the state sent several messages at once. First, it asserted that justice in Burkina Faso does not need foreign visual approval to be legitimate. Second, it connected authority to domestic production, strengthening local economic networks rather than external suppliers. Third, it embedded national identity into the daily rituals of governance, not just ceremonial moments. The difference between encouragement and institutionalization is critical here. Encouragement relies on personal choice and symbolism. Institutionalization reshapes norms by repetition and rule. When judges, clerks, and officials repeatedly appear in state-sanctioned traditional attire, the association between authority and local culture becomes routine. Over time, it stops being noticed. That is precisely the point. Burkina Faso's strategy shows how cultural sovereignty can be enforced quietly, without dramatic declarations. By changing what the state wears when it exercises power, the country altered how power is perceived. Authority no longer arrives dressed as an inheritance. It arrives dressed as something produced at home. In this sense, clothing became infrastructure. It reinforced the idea that sovereignty is practiced daily, not announced once. Burkina Faso did not ask whether traditional dress could coexist with modern governance. It demonstrated that governance itself can be reclothed. If Ghana's parliamentary moment represented cultural confidence through consensus, then Ibrahim Traore's Burkina Faso represents something more forceful. Under Traore, traditional dress is not merely encouraged as a symbol. It is deployed as part of a broader strategy to dismantle colonial residue from everyday state power. In this context, clothing becomes a front line of political transformation. Traore's approach rests on a simple but radical premise. If a state continues to look like its former rulers, then independence remains incomplete. Flags and anthems may change, but authority still performs itself through inherited forms. By altering those forms, the state sends a signal that power has changed hands not only legally, but psychologically. Traditional fabric such as faso dan fani plays a central role in this logic. It is not chosen because it is decorative or nostalgic, but because it is local, labor-intensive, and embedded in domestic production. When state officials wear cloth produced by local weavers, authority becomes visibly linked to the national economy. Power is no longer imported. It is manufactured at home. This strategy also addresses a deeper social divide. In many post-colonial states, government institutions appear distant and foreign to ordinary citizens. Offices, uniforms, and rituals often resemble replicas of European systems, reinforcing the perception that the state does not belong to the people. By redressing authority in familiar cultural forms, Traore's government reduces that distance. The state looks less like an inherited structure and more like a collective project. Critically, this is not framed as a rejection of modern governance. Courts still function. Bureaucracies still operate. Laws are still enforced. What changes is the visual language through which authority communicates. Modernity is no longer equated with imitation. It is redefined as self-confidence. There is also a psychological dimension. When citizens repeatedly see judges, officials, and leaders dressed in locally produced attire, a subtle shift occurs. Respect for institutions becomes less dependent on foreign validation. Pride replaces imitation. Over time, this can alter how authority is internalized, especially among younger generations. Traore's use of traditional dress therefore fits within a larger project of decolonizing state consciousness. It does not claim that culture alone solves political problems. Instead, it asserts that without cultural sovereignty, political sovereignty remains fragile. By changing how power appears, Burkina Faso is attempting to change how power is understood. In this sense, clothing is no longer an accessory to politics. It is policy. And, under Traore, it is used deliberately to reshape the relationship between the state, its people, and its past. John Dramani Mahama's role in this broader story operates very differently from Ibrahim Traore's, yet it arrives at a similar destination, where Traore reshapes authority through command and institutional redesign. Mahama works through restraint, symbolism, and consensus. His approach represents a softer but no less strategic expression of Pan-African confidence. When Mahama wore the fugu during a state visit and faced ridicule abroad, he did not escalate the moment into a diplomatic dispute. He did not issue defensive statements or demand apologies. Instead, he allowed the situation to unfold. That restraint was not weakness. It was calculation. By avoiding personal confrontation, Mahama left space for the response to emerge from society and from institutions rather than from ego. The result was telling. Ghana's parliament responded collectively, transforming what could have remained a personal slight into a national position. This shift matters because it relocated the conversation from individual taste to institutional legitimacy. The issue was no longer whether Mahama had dressed appropriately. The issue became whether African identity itself was considered appropriate within spaces of power. Mahama's Pan-Africanism functions through normalization rather than disruption. He does not seek to shock or overturn systems overnight. Instead, he allows symbols to circulate until they become difficult to dismiss. By wearing traditional attire confidently and without apology, he treats it as ordinary rather than exceptional. That ordinariness is precisely what gives the gesture strength. There is also a diplomatic dimension to this strategy. By refusing to frame the incident as hostility between nations, Mahama preserved space for unity rather than division. The emphasis remained on shared African dignity, not inter-African rivalry. This aligns with a broader Pan-African vision in which respect is built internally before it is demanded externally. In this sense, Mahama uses culture as a form of quiet leverage. He does not argue that Africa should reject the world. He demonstrates that Africa can engage the world without disguising itself. The message is subtle but firm. Respect follows confidence, not imitation. Mahama's influence lies in this ability to make sovereignty appear calm rather than combative. By letting institutions and citizens echo his choices, he transforms personal symbolism into collective identity. His approach shows that cultural assertion does not always need to be loud. Sometimes it only needs to be consistent. Together with the harder edge represented by Burkina Faso, Mahama's method completes the picture. One path enforces new norms through structure. The other dissolves old norms through familiarity. Both point toward the same conclusion. African authority no longer needs to dress itself in borrowed certainty. As African leaders and institutions reclaim traditional dress within spaces of power, a predictable wave of criticism follows, largely shaped by Western political and media frameworks. These reactions are rarely framed as outright hostility. Instead, they appear as skepticism, dismissal, or condescension. The language is subtle, but the assumptions beneath it are clear. One common critique suggests that such gestures are merely symbolic distractions. Critics argue that changing clothing does not fix economic hardship, security challenges, or governance failures. From this perspective, traditional attire is portrayed as theater, something cosmetic and ultimately irrelevant. The underlying implication is that seriousness must be measured by policy alignment with Western norms, not by cultural self-definition. Another frequent response frames cultural assertion as nationalism or regression. Traditional dress is sometimes described as backward-looking, emotional, or incompatible with modern statehood. This argument assumes that progress has a single visual language, one historically shaped by Europe. It leaves little room for the idea that modernity can wear different faces without losing substance. There is also a tendency to politicize appearance selectively. When Western leaders dress casually or adopt local customs abroad, these moments are praised as relatability or cultural sensitivity. When African leaders center their own traditions, the same behavior is recast as provocation or insecurity. This double standard reveals that the issue is not clothing itself, but who is permitted to define legitimacy. The most effective response to these critiques is not outrage, but clarity. Symbolism does not replace policy, but it shapes the environment in which policy is received. Before laws are trusted or institutions respected, authority must first be recognized as belonging. Clothing is one of the fastest ways to signal that belonging. Moreover, these gestures are not isolated. In Burkina Faso, traditional attire was linked to local production and state institutions. In Ghana, it was normalized through parliament rather than imposed by decree. In both cases, symbolism was paired with structure. That pairing undermines the claim that cultural assertion is empty performance. The deeper question critics avoid is this: why should African authority continue to borrow its visual legitimacy from former rulers? If independence is real, then self-definition must extend beyond flags and constitutions. It must enter the daily rituals of governance. Seen this way, the criticism reveals more about lingering hierarchies than about African politics. The discomfort arises when old standards lose their monopoly. As those standards are questioned, resistance is inevitable. But it is also a sign that something fundamental is shifting. The debate over dress is therefore not trivial. It is a visible struggle over who gets to define seriousness, modernity, and power. And increasingly, African states are answering that question for themselves. When the stories of Ghana and Burkina Faso are placed side by side, a broader lesson emerges for the rest of the continent. Cultural sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a practice. And, like all practices, it must be repeated, institutionalized, and protected from being reduced to spectacle. The first lesson is that symbolism works best when it operates on two levels. Ghana demonstrates the power of collective normalization. By bringing traditional dress into parliament through consensus, it made cultural confidence appear ordinary rather than radical. Burkina Faso demonstrates the power of structure. By embedding traditional fabric into state institutions, it ensured that symbolism did not depend on personal preference. Together, these approaches show that lasting change requires both social acceptance and institutional reinforcement. The second lesson is that cultural assertion must be connected to material reality. When traditional attire is linked to local production, employment, and domestic supply chains, it stops being purely symbolic. It becomes economic. Burkina Faso's use of locally produced cloth shows how identity can support livelihoods. This connection matters because it grounds pride in daily life, not abstract rhetoric. The third lesson is restraint. Cultural sovereignty does not require hostility toward the outside world. Neither Mahama nor Traore argues for isolation. What they reject is imitation without purpose. Engagement remains possible, but it takes place on terms defined from within. Respect is not demanded through confrontation. It is established through consistency. There is also a cautionary note. If cultural gestures are not supported by accountable governance, they risk becoming hollow. Clothing alone does not deliver justice, security, or prosperity. But without cultural confidence, reforms struggle to gain legitimacy. The challenge for African states is not choosing between symbolism and substance, but aligning them. At its core, this debate is about who has the authority to define authority. For decades, that definition was borrowed. Suits and imported rituals became the visual proof of seriousness. Today, that monopoly is weakening. African states are beginning to assert that power can look like the people it governs. The shift may appear subtle, a different fabric, a different silhouette. But history often turns on such details. When authority changes its appearance, it signals a deeper transformation underway. This is not the end of the story. It is an opening. As more African societies question inherited norms, the language of power will continue to evolve. The question is no longer whether Africa can govern itself. That question was settled long ago. The question now is whether it will do so in its own image. Understanding these moments is not about nostalgia. It is about recognizing that sovereignty is lived, not declared, and sometimes it begins with what a nation chooses to wear when it rules.